Trump has presented Ukraine with his final offer to achieve a peace agreement. It is likely going to fail, and why I'm going to explain to you in this video. We are also going to talk about what else has happened along the front lines and behind them. But as said, all of this here in this situation report about the war in Ukraine. A Russian mill blogger said that the Russians recently conducted airstrikes against Odessa with drones. There they have used the Geran 3 drones. Those are a drone with a jet engine to achieve a much higher speed of 500 to 600 kilometers an hour. They also flew higher to avoid the mobile defense teams that usually are fairly successful in intercepting those drones. With flying high enough, they don't just get out of range out of machine weapons, so heavy machine guns as well as autocannons, but they are also, if they fly high enough, they will force the Ukrainians to use proper SAM systems, as even the manpads only have a limited altitude range. The drones in this attack were in a holding pattern close to the area, while other drones made a new reconnaissance over the target. And after that, the Russians adjusted the targeting data to then do a concentrated attack, a coordinated attack with simultaneous strikes from different angles to overwhelm and oversaturate the Ukrainian air defense. This new tactics, which was first published by the German tabloid Bild, and we talked about it like a couple of weeks ago, has shown to be fairly successful. In the latest strike, we've seen the success rate go consistently up. So the Russians found a way to overwhelm the Ukrainian air defense as of now, as even manpads have a theoretical range, altitude range, usually of no more than 5 kilometers. But as I have to emphasize, this is theoretical, as it's the maximum altitude. If the drone flies in 4 kilometers distance, then the realistic altitude is probably more a kilometer or a kilometer and a half. So manpads will mostly be out of the picture, even if the drones just fly 4 to 5 kilometers high. If they fly at 6 or 7 kilometers in altitude, then the Ukrainians would have to use fighter jets, or they would have to use proper SAM systems that are meant for different systems. This is much a big improvement for the Russians, as they force the Ukrainians to use SAM systems where they only have limited availability, both in systems as well as in ammunition, while the Russians can produce the Geran 3 drones, and likely in a much higher volume than Ukraine can acquire air defense missiles. So this should tilt the balance to the Russians if it continues like this. The Russians also struck a bus in Dnipro a couple of hours ago, 9 civilian deaths. 30 were wounded. It was struck with a drone inside of Dnipro, so assumingly the Russians did know what they were attacking. The 51st Arsenal, that is a ammunition storage in Kishach in Vladimir, has exploded. The Ukrainians are saying that it had 105,000 tons of ammunition and weaponry inside of it. We can see here that FIRMS has shown that fire is over the majority over the area. In total, not just 105,000 tons were in there, but ammunition for artillery, missiles, air defense, and multiple launch rocket systems missions. The Russians themselves say it was a mistake. Apparently somebody smoked again and it blew up. In the end, it doesn't really matter. It definitely blew up. And we have here satellite pictures show that the geometric setup has changed significantly. This is lets us assume that the vast majority of it has seen damage, the vast majority of the area. The Ukrainians also struck the Shahid factory in Yelabuga in Tatarstan. 5 strikes, 5 hits are being reported. To the degree of the damage, I can't say much yet. We switch to the developments along the front line, and the Ukrainians are reporting that the Russians do send reconnaissance forces over the border in Chernihiv, in Sumy, as well as in Kharkiv, so basically along the whole northern border. They say that the Russians try to cross it. Usually the Ukrainians report that they defeated those groups, but that's it, what I have from all the area, as the fighting has resumed, obviously, after the the Easter truce, which was only halfway held, but during the Easter truce, the intensity definitely went down a significant part. And so far in the area here, I do not see any change in territory. We also do not have anything on the Eastern Front where the control has changed. The Ukrainians are saying the Russians used the ceasefire to bring in forces with RPGs and machine guns, so heavier weapons that are more difficult to carry because of the higher weight. They used the ceasefire, the truce, to bring them forward to the front line to then do a massive attack afterwards. This was more or less to be expected. I've talked about it in the last situation report that the Russians were reported to use the ceasefire for rotations for sending supplies, but the Ukrainians did the same as well. This is what a ceasefire or a truce in German, it's the same. So I think the truce is the correct word here. The truce is used by all sides, basically. So we can expect the Ukrainians, having resupplied their frontline troops as well, they won't just watch the Russians do that and do nothing themselves. And as long as that's not banned under some kind of agreement, that's perfectly fair game, unfortunately. South of the Seversky Donetsk, no change in the Seversk and Chasiv Yar region from what I've seen, but I do have some changes in Toretsk. Here at Toretsk, we have the Russians northwest of Krimsk, where they likely took a position. The Ukrainians are still inside of Toretsk. We have a fresh geolocation. We had them recently here as well. The Ukrainians thus still have a position inside of it. And south of Toretsk, we have the Russians here southwest of Petrivka. So the last geolocation was here. Now we have the Russians apparently reaching the Petrivka from the southwest. Here the video shows them entering a trench system. It's unclear whether they gained a foothold there, whether they set up permanent positions, but it's certainly possible. That would mean the front line would have moved to this degree, but we'll have to wait until we have further informations. Further south, we have the Russians at two positions inside of Sucha Balka. Here we have them in the south, and the new geolocation is further north. So Sucha Balka has now fallen to the Russians. They managed to push the Ukrainians further away. This area is now under Russian control as well. We go to the Pokrovsk region, and here the Russians have advanced inside of Tarasivka. We have a geolocation of this as well. Now they are further up the town. They have almost reached the northern part. We had them recently in the southern areas, even though the deep state map still shows that to be under Ukrainian control. The Russians have now roughly reached this area here. The Russians also advanced west of Slovianka here in the area here. Roughly this area, they gained some ground, but that's it from what I have at Pokrovsk. We have one more development close to Konstantinopil here at Rozliv. We have the Russians advancing and reaching the tree line here. I'm not sure whether they managed to gain a foothold, but we have continued Russian activity here. On the Oblast border, close to Velika Novosilka, the Russians have now taken Dnipro Energia. Here the town had already shown Russian presence over the past weeks. Now we have the Ukrainian confirmation that the majority of the town is in Russian control. That's it with territorial changes. Not too much has changed along the front line. The Russians have restarted the offensive and obviously used the Easter truce over the past few days, but so far it has not helped them in any significant advances along the front line. The biggest news clearly is not from the front lines, but from behind them. We have the Financial Times here reporting that Putin now has said he's willing to basically freeze the front line. This article explains in detail what the Russians would achieve for that. He would receive the acknowledgement, the de jure acknowledgement for the Crimea to be Russian. So the Ukrainians would sign off and saying, we accept Crimea to be permanently an integral part of the Russian Federation. They would give up all claims to the Crimean Peninsula. This would be something the Ukrainians would have to do. They would also not be able to join NATO and would sign off on this as well. Ukraine would also agree to not reconquer area that is occupied by the Russians. So they would agree publicly to accept the front lines as they are, and the United States would give up sanctions, would stop the sanctions against Russia. Now, if you paid attention, you know that it only mentioned what basically Ukraine and the West does in regards to the Russians, and the Russians do nothing. They accept that the front line doesn't move anymore, and as you've seen in the past 3 or 4 months, the front line hasn't moved much anyways. So the Russians, the Trump peace plan is not demanding anything from the Russians except to stop the fighting. Ukraine would receive nothing in return except that the fighting does stop, where they manage to hold their own as of now. We have the Moscow Times also in an article talking about this as well, and the things behind it, and that article is highly interesting as well. According to it, Ukraine is to be used by the Russian government as a bargaining chip in bigger agreements, in more global agreements with the United States. They even talk about allowing Trump to build a 150-story Trump Tower in the business quarter of Moscow. So he would have a prestigious object here. They think they can buy him with this. This is what the Russians believe. They also say they want to keep his attention with the resource deal to force the United States to give them something in return. For instance, the reduction of weapon deliveries to Ukraine. Basically, the Moscow Times states in detail how the Russians play the United States, and that they know what to do to keep the United States looking elsewhere and just keep up pressure towards the Ukrainians while achieving more and more things on their own in their own negotiations. Otherwise, if they don't achieve that, they want the negotiations to fail, with Trump blaming Ukraine. J.D. Vance has once again said, if we don't receive a positive answer to our offer, then we'll walk away from the negotiations. In total, it's basically the Russians demanding that that they are to get whatever they want, and the Ukrainians will not receive anything. So far, we have the Ukrainian government here. Zelensky said publicly that he rules out recognizing Crimea as Russian. This was to be expected. As far as I know, he can't even do that. It needs a constitutional change for this. And then again, why would he? Why would he give something when he gets nothing in return? The Russians, especially as it's not even over. We have here TASS reporting that the occupation governor of the Russians for Kherson is saying Kiev must hand over control over the Dnipro in Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Dnipro province as well. So we're talking about an area probably up to here. He says Russia needs control over all of this here to allow for shipping on the Dnipro again and economic development. This shows additional territorial ambitions by Russian politicians and occupation administrative persons. This is also published by TASS, so this is kind of official as well. It clearly shows that the Russians aim for something like Novorossiya. This is the map they are also spreading. Often this province here is marked as Russian as well, but this is basically what the Russian nationalists want from Ukraine. All of this plus often this province here as well. Ukraine is not supposed to get anything in return. We have right now, the Ukrainians would have to give up on NATO membership. We could argue that handing over Crimea, accepting Crimea as Russian, would be acceptable if Ukraine would get something in return. If, for instance, they would achieve NATO membership. If the promise was, the offer was, you will get into NATO. Until you are in NATO, you will get protection by all the willing NATO forces, including the United States. But in return, you hand over Crimea. That could be an acceptable deal. Of course, the Ukrainian viewers here will be outraged by this, but we know that nations can survive something like this. Finland has lost 2 wars in a row against Moscow, and today is a vibrant democracy democracy, one of the freest nations in the world, and has just joined NATO after joining the European Union quite a while ago. So Ukraine could have a future even after the loss of Kiev, but they would have to receive something in return of Kiev. And right now they are just to accept loss after loss after loss without anything in return, without no security for the future, which would mean that as soon as the ceasefire is in effect, as soon as the mobilization ends, as soon as the martial law ends, everyone demobilized who fears that soon he might have to fight again will look for ways to leave the country permanently. Refugees will not go home unless they have to, and the youth will look abroad to find a future in an area that is less prone to face another Russian invasion where they might have to fight. Ukraine will end up significantly weaker after this, while the Russians will end up significantly stronger, and Ukraine will get nothing in return. Nothing whatsoever, while they're not even beaten on the front lines. We could talk about a deal like this if Ukraine was defeated, but Ukraine is far from being defeated right now, and the United States expect them to accept basically something close to a capitulation for nothing in return. Right now, the first depots in Russia will empty out. So the Russians will start having more serious equipment problems next year. The Russians will get a breather with anything like this, and Trump will not be in office for long. They might just try afterwards again to continue to finish it all up. And while the Russians get a breather, while they have time to no longer face losses and build up their forces, Ukraine's aid, international aid, will likely get smaller. To tell your own population that they have to cut back on things, that they have to live with higher taxes. I'm sorry, we can't reduce your taxes because we have to send money and weapons to Ukraine, which isn't even fighting for its survival right now, will be a tough sell, and thus will obviously be difficult to implement. So we can expect the help for Ukraine to shrink in the coming years while Russia gets stronger by the year. And in total, this is a proposition that Ukraine has no reason to sign. It's better to simply keep fighting and hope that the Europeans get their shit together, get their act together and help out Ukraine, or hope that the Russians run out, because the Russians will run out of material in a perspective future. Now, it's too early to say this is in 12 months or this is in 18 months, because an empty depot doesn't mean they ran out of tanks. It just means the depot is empty. The tanks aren't necessarily destroyed yet. They might be on a parking lot for a factory. They might be inside of the factory. So it might even take another 6 months or even another year until the tanks stop coming out of the factory, the old ones, until the Russians genuinely have run out of all depot stocks. But the depots will start to empty out this very year. So for the Russians, the availability for weaponry is being reduced, and that the North Koreans can make up for all of this is fairly unlikely. And obviously, with a ceasefire collapsing, the prospect for a ceasefire collapsing, volunteers should be harder to find in Russia as well, as they will expect that they now will have to continue fighting. So the Russian recruitment number should go down, which then will force Russia to either pay even more for its recruits, while the Ukrainians are pummeling the Russian oil infrastructure, because that's their best way in a war of attrition to take the Russians out. So the Russians have less money, have to spend more on volunteers, and will likely face the prospect in a year or something like this that they might have to do another round of mobilization, which will then again diminish the available workforce, which will again drive people to leave the country, which will again make the Russians mad at the government like it did last time. So Ukraine has a chance. There's a good reason for Ukraine to keep fighting, unless they are beaten, which they are not, or unless they are being given a deal that is acceptable to them, which this one is not. So I do not see the Ukrainians accepting that. They don't have a reason to. It's madness for them. It's basically coming close to a capitulation. Should they accept something like this? And so Zelensky already said we're not going to accept Crimea to go to Putin to go to Russia. Then we have to see once this has happened, if Ukraine doesn't accept that, which I don't think it will, then Trump will very likely blame Ukraine. He'll blame Ukraine because he also has a problem with Zelensky, as we've seen. And of course, Zelensky didn't help him against Biden. Zelensky is indirectly responsible for the first impeachment against him, while Trump likes Putin. So he will blame Ukraine. He will blame Zelensky. He will also blame Zelensky that he destroyed the peace prospect and thus make sure that Trump doesn't get a Nobel Prize for peace. If Ukraine will receive additional aid from the United States afterward is more than questionable. Intelligence aid would be the cheap thing, but seeing what the United States have done after that disastrous meeting in the White House, if they blame Zelensky for derailing the peace agreement, why would they help Ukraine to keep fighting? So I do not think that intelligence sharing will continue. That seems unlikely. Weapons might continue, but only for economic reasons, meaning if they are well paid. Because the US, with the current tariff policies, will face economic hardships. More and more nations are orienting themselves away from the United States to buy their future gear. We heard that from Portugal. We hear that currently from Canada. There are various ideas to buy less from the United States or as little as possible, which will drive up prices. So for Trump, it will be important to sell as many weapons as possible to keep the demand high and thus the prices for the US military itself low, and to keep the people employed, obviously. So for that reason, he might be willing to sell to Ukraine, but that's purely speculative right now. And that he will send anything for free, I think we shouldn't have the illusion. As said, this is a lot of speculative right now, but I think it's somewhat informed speculative, but we'll have to see in the coming weeks and months how this will continue. That the Ukrainians will sign off on this seems extremely unlikely, especially as Europe is willing to continue Ukraine's fight, and then Ukraine has an alternative to this. But that's at least it for me for now. If you like the situation report, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm, despite the topic. And leave a comment if you have something to add. If you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.